Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a wonderful suggestion one of you made. And so I put a little list together, 10 unfinished masterpieces that somehow subsequently got finished by other people, by the finishers. What's kind of interesting about this list is, first of all, how many of these works are operas. I find that fascinating, possibly because in writing operas, composers make sketches and do bits, and they don't always do them in order. And so, you can like fill in the gaps, or because the entire libretto exists, the text, and so you know where it's going, and maybe that helps. I don't know, but there's a whole passel of them that we're going to talk about. Then there are symphonies and other works as well. I think people are a little bit more hesitant to muck about with symphonies and other abstract orchestral works because, unlike operas, you don't know where they're going. And sometimes, when a composer's style is that personal, it's very difficult for other artists to enter into it, at least enter into it persuasively. But, we'll talk about each case as it comes up. So here are the 10. We have to begin with Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. Now, here's a piece that, its nickname gets its cachet from the fact that it's unfinished. So who would want to finish it? What do you call it if it gets finished? It's a big problem, actually. Schubert's Unfinished has long been regarded as so completely perfect in its two-movement completed form, at least the two-movement Schubert finished, that it really took quite an effort before anyone wanted to touch the rest of it. All that exists of the rest of it, the scherzo and finale, is the opening theme of the scherzo, just the first few bars, and nothing whatsoever of the finale. So any attempted completion is going to be entirely conjectural. Some people have said that the B minor entr'acte from the Rosamunde incidental music that Schubert wrote was the actual finale of the Eighth Symphony, or could be, and sometimes it's been used that way. And since then, various people have attempted to, do what Schubert didn't do. But it's never caught on. It's never caught on at all, for good reason, because it's not by Schubert. It's not going to be by Schubert. What the hell is the point, right? The only reason we listen to Schubert's Unfinished Symphony is because it's by Schubert, not because it's by Joe Schmo, the guy who decided he was going to finish it. So, yeah, the whole thing is silly. Absolutely silly. And by the way, as we go through these works, these are works that were substantively, in some way, possibly kind of sort of complete, maybe. The completion of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony falls into the same category as works like Beethoven's 10th or Tchaikovsky's 7th, or, there really isn't enough of it to make anything serious out of it. So this is an example of all of those which we no longer have to worry about, frankly, because, they're all in the same category. Things that the composer never really wrote. And all the rest is speculation. So, Next, Berg, Lulu, the great second opera by Alban Berg, which was completed by Friedrich Serha. And this is a wholly successful effort on Serha's part. It's perfectly fine. It works marvelously. The reason it works so well, first of all, is that Berg actually, he extracted something called the Lulu Symphony, but it was, it's a suite of excerpts from the opera, which concludes a big chunk of the final scene. So a lot of that's there. Then there's recurring motives, and there's, and all kinds of charts and tables of 12-tone thingies and God knows what. But there was a lot of it done, basically. And the opera itself, because of what Berg actually accomplished by the time he died, it was not such a big deal to put the rest of it together. And because it's atonal, no one's going to know if what the guy did was right or wrong. Anyway, there's that. As long as it sounds, effectively atonal, then it's going to be fine, right? But no, it all just flows seamlessly, and you really need to hear the whole opera because it has a plot that really ends at the end when Lulu finally gets murdered by Jack the Ripper. And, you have to hear the whole story. So even if Serha's completion wasn't as good as it really is, it would be a problem to play the opera in its incomplete form, which it was done. It was played and recorded incomplete for quite some time. but there was no reason for it. There was really, really no reason for it. It's effectively finished, and now it's done, and everyone's happy, and that's the opposite of the Schubert Unfinished type completion. Then we get the in-between cases. The in-between cases, such as Puccini's Turandot. Oh, my goodness. Yes. Now, here's an opera that was very, very complete up to the point at which Puccini died, which was the death of Lulu. Fortunately, he managed to murder her before he passed away himself, because, the whole point of Puccini operas is finding these sweet, innocent young girls and torturing them to death. I mean, that was Puccini's thing. So the final scene was really a problem. That was the scene at which he was supposed to transform Turandot, the ice princess, into a flesh and blood, panting, palpitating, sex-crazed young woman, and Koloff, who is the most selfish bastard in all of opera, and who was completely unsympathetic from start to finish, was somehow supposed to become tolerable. Now, that task was probably impossible. The best completion of Turandot is mine, frankly. My completion of Turandot is very straightforward and extremely simple, which is right after the death of Liu, Ping Pang and Pong show up and say, "We've had it with this crap, murder the bitch," and they all kill Turandot and Koloff. That's it. The Chinese populace revolts, and it ends in about 30 seconds. And in order to do that, all you need to do is find a few words in Italian and then attach the ending of Saint-Saëns, Samson, and Delilah, where the temple collapses and everyone's screaming and shrieking and carrying on. It would be fine. And you could all go home and we'd be happy. But no, we do have the complete libretto, and so we have to go through the business where she finds out Koloff's name, as if anyone cares, and then she realizes that she's in love, and she's panting and drooling and oozing and whatever she's doing, and Koloff sort of sits there like, okay, whatever. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So they got Franco Alfano to do this. They also got Luciano Berio to do it, believe it or not. I mean, his completion is even worse. Alfano was a really, really second-rate composer, and Puccini had left sketches. There are sketches, and he put together the ending. It sounds so not like Puccini. It's amazing, even though it uses some of Puccini's tunes. It fascinates me. I remember the first time I ever heard Turandot. I didn't know that it was unfinished. I didn't read the notes. It was the Leinsdorf, Birgit Nielsen, Jussi Björling recording. And I'm listening to this whole thing, and Liu dies, and then you turn over, because it was 3 sides, 3 records, and you turn over the next side was the completion. And it starts out, and I was not paying much attention. I was reading a book while it was going, and all of a sudden I just sat bolt upright, and I went, that's not Puccini. I mean, that's how sharp the demarcation is in style, first of all. Then there's the most horrible phrase in all of vocal music, which is the one where Koloff says what his name is. Where it goes da 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 da. I'm Koloff, son of Timur. I mean, oh my God, it's the cheesiest, most worthless, awful, tacky, just terrible, absolutely terrible. So, and the ending is sort of like, sounds like a Broadway musical where they all come back and recapitulate the big tune. I mean, it's awful. But we play it. We play it because it ends the story. We have the text. We know how it's got to end. Someone's got to do it, right? So they do it. I still think my version is best. Let them just murder everyone and go home. But that's me. Okay. Next, this is a totally successful completion along the lines of Lulu, although we don't know how conjectural it is. It's kind of interesting. Manuel de Falla's Atlántida. Atlántida is this sort of strange opera oratorio thing that involves Christopher Columbus and the founding of the New World and Catholic Spain and Queen Isabella and Hercules and mythology and Atlantis, and it's a whole thing. It really is. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful piece. When Falla worked on it for 20 years, and Falla was one of those composers who wrote virtually nothing, right? I mean, he wrote There's La Vida Breve, there's El Amor Brujo, there's El Sombrero de Tres Picos, there's Nights in the Gardens of Spain, there's a few piano pieces, there's a couple of songs, and that's the harpsichord concerto and El Retablo de Master Pedro or whatever, Master Peter's puppet show thing. That's it. That's Falla. I mean, a dozen works maybe, which he polished incessantly throughout his life. And so it's not surprising that when he died, in Argentina, by the way, he was a refugee from the Spanish Civil War, he had not finished Atlántida, which would have been his largest work. It's a good couple of hours long. And so his student and colleague, Ernesto Halfter, decided to complete it. Now, Halfter was a wonderful choice because Halfter also wrote virtually nothing in his life. And he was a Spanish composer who was clearly of the same school, a similar aesthetic. There are pieces of his his wonderful Sinfonieto. I mean, they're very Falla-esque. So Atlántida was a good project for him, and he worked on that for like 20 years or 100 years or whatever it was. He produced several versions of it, finally only doing the last one really towards the end of his life. And it was recorded once. It's been recorded. It was on Ovidis, which I have somewhere sitting around here. It's sitting here. The earlier version was recorded, I think, by Rafael Frubeck de Burgos for EMI. It's really, really a lovely work. And I think his completion is totally successful. A lot of it has to be necessarily conjectural. But here you have two composers whose styles were really simpatico. And so it worked extremely well. And if you haven't heard Atlántida and you like Manuel de Falla, you may want to give it a chance at some point. It's not as well known as some of these other pieces, but it's a wonderful example of the process, and one where the composer and the completor definitely were on the same page. So that's that. Then we have Weber, Die Drei Pintos. Well, this is interesting. Weber's opera, Die Drei Pintos, is actually by Mahler. Most people don't know that Mahler wrote an opera, but he did. Die Drei Pintos was, again, the libretto exists, and Weber made some sketches. That's all that exists. He didn't complete anything. There were just some sketches. And, the fact of the matter is that Mahler was having an affair with Weber's granddaughter, I think it was, Marianne Weber, or whatever it was, who was married to someone else, by the way. He was a young, hot-blooded, up-and-coming conductor, and he had this torrid affair with her. And while he was hanging out at the Webers, they showed him the sketches that Weber had done for Die Drei Pintos, and they asked him to put it together and see what they could do. And so he wrote a faux Weber opera. Now, Mahler knew Weber's style very well. His own style, even then, was extremely, extremely well formed, especially in terms of orchestration. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in this opera that Weber would not have done, like a root part, bundle of sticks. You hit the bass drum with it, percussion and other things. But stylistically, it's very good. It's really very good. Mahler knew how to write his faux Weber. He loved Weber. And so he wrote this opera. And we know exactly how much was Weber and how much was Mahler because he told us. He told us very clearly which was a Weber sketch and which bit he invented by himself. And some of the best numbers are by Mahler himself. But it all works. Again, it's not a well-known piece. For some reason, it deserves to be better known because it's an opera comique. It has dialogue and whatnot, but the music is delicious. Absolutely delicious, especially the romance of the lovesick cat from the first act, which is all Mahler, by the way. It has nothing to do with Weber. Mahler had a great sense of humor. He really knew how to do it, and it was very successful initially. It made Mahler a lot of money. So that's a piece that's worth looking into. There's a lousy recording on Naxos and a really marvelous recording featuring Lucia Pop and others on Irato, which was RCA back in the day. And where that is, I have no idea. I hope that it pops up one of these years. Or if it's still around, it would be great because it's a lovely work. Definitely worth hearing. So that's the first 5. Now we come into the second half of our survey of finished, unfinished pieces. Elgar Symphony No. 3. Oh, I loathe this thing. It's horrible. Elgar's Symphony No. 3 also consists of some inchoate sketches, and they were assembled by one Anthony Payne, And oh, what a big splash it made in the UK. They couldn't get enough of it. They recorded it immediately, like 3 or 4 times. Major people did it. It sucks. It's just boring, and it doesn't really even sound like Elgar. And it's there wasn't enough to go on. I mean, much too much of it is conjectural, and much too much of it is conjectural by people who had no business conjecturing what Elgar was possibly maybe thinking of. I mean, this is one of those misguided efforts where, if there isn't enough to go on, just don't. I mean, you just don't do it. Don't make yourself crazy. I mean, there are ways to do things with fragments, with sketches. Probably the most brilliant of all is Berio's rendering, which is a bit of an uncompleted Schubert symphony, where the bits that Schubert didn't complete are filled in, but in Berio's own style, a totally different style, making the piece a hybrid, a work in which one composer comments on another, and the commentary illuminates what the composer actually accomplished. It's really a beautiful conception, and it works extremely well. Even the clash of styles, the atonal Berio stuff and the tonal Schubert stuff, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. It's wonderful because it doesn't try to be what it's not, which is Schubert's own completion of the work. That's the point, right? So the Elgar Third is just a hopeless wreck. It's a hot mess of a piece. And, well, it doesn't mean it's not listenable. Doesn't mean people can't enjoy it. But it sure as hell ain't Elgar. Next, another opera, Borodin, Prince Igor. Oh, wow, yeah, where we get the Polovetzian dances, or the Polovtsian dances, however you want to pronounce them. It doesn't matter. That's it. Prince Igor, I mean, Borodin was one of those sometime composers, like so many of these Russian composers. They had day jobs, and they didn't get to write a lot of music, and Borodin really finished very little. You've got 2 symphonies, string quartets, and piano music. That's about it. The Third Symphony wasn't finished, and Prince Igor was also left in just a pile of messy things in various stages of completion. And those all-time great completists, Rimsky-Korsakov and Alexander Glazunov, got their hands on it, and they finished it. They put it into performable shape, and it's really a fun opera. It's charming, it's fun, it's colorful, it's glitzy. It's got the Polovetzian dances in the middle of it. When you go to Polovetsia and dance, which is all they did in Polovetsia, apparently. And it's great. It's the only way that we'll ever hear the piece. And it was accepted because of, the reputations of Rimsky and Glazunov in the day. Everything they did, whether it was the reorchestration of Boris Godunov or A Night on Bald Mountain, or all these things that they worked on to help their less, either less talented or less available colleagues finish their music. It was all accepted as part of the same school. I mean, they were all romantic nationalists, all sort of working on the same wavelength, much as with Falla's Atlántida and Ernesto Halfter. And so people accept their completions as fair, as legitimate. I mean, Rimsky's reorchestration and slight recomposition of Boris Godunov is now on the outs, but it was excellently made, beautifully done out of love. And it works too. It works too, because there's nothing stylistically incongruent in the main with what these composers were after, which also suggests that their personal styles were not so personal that others couldn't sort of step in and simply take over where they left off. That was certainly true of Borodin. It's more controversial when it comes to Mussorgsky, because in Mussorgsky's case, his incompetence and clumsiness is considered a stylistic plus. So there are issues there in dealing with, reorchestrating or changing what Mussorgsky wrote, particularly harmonically, where he was really very interesting, whether intentionally or not, who knows. But with Borodin, it's not a controversial issue at all. And so the edition of Prince Igor that we have is the only one that there is, and nobody seems to be running around making new ones, probably because the piece isn't performed often enough to justify the time and the expense in any case. So that's Prince Igor. Next, Bartók, his Viola Concerto, his last orchestral work. Now, when Bartók died, The last few bars of his third piano concerto were also incomplete, but they only required some orchestration to just finish the thing off. And his colleague, Tibor Surly, I think that's who it was, got his hands on the sketches for his viola concerto and turned it into a viola concerto. I don't like that piece either. I don't think it's just a very pleasant piece to listen to. I don't mean pleasant in like, ha-ha, light music. I mean pleasant as in satisfying. And the piece is performed because it's theoretically the last work that Bartók wrote, and also because it's a viola concerto, and there aren't so many great viola concerti out there. I mean, just a tiny handful, and he was a major, major composer. So, of course, everyone is interested in his thoughts on the viola concerto, but it's not, in my view, a terribly successful completion. I don't get much joy out of listening to it. I don't know how grateful it is for violists, but it exists on the fringes of Bartók's works. There's a sense, I think, that it doesn't quite work or come together. It's never been accepted as a legitimate work of Bartók. So, he tried, but the jury is still out on whether or not that's successful or how to what extent it should be viewed as a legitimate example of Bartók's late genius. So there's that. Next, we have the two biggies to end with. Of course, Mahler's 10th Symphony. I mean, I could do Bruckner's 9th too, but I don't accept any of the completions of Bruckner's 9th. I probably wouldn't have accepted Bruckner's completion of Bruckner's 9th because the last movement's just awful. I mean, it's just awful every way you think about it. But I mentioned it here, so there you go. Now, Mahler's 10th is an interesting case also because Mahler told his wife, at least as far as what she told us, that the work was completed in the sketch, that she could do with it as she saw fit. And the sketch is complete in the sense that he had the whole conception in his head, and there is a melodic thread that goes through the entire thing from beginning to end. So we know where it's going. Now, as we progress, especially when it comes to the last two movements, there's a lot missing. I mean, the orchestration's missing, a lot of the harmony and filler parts are missing, the counterpoint is missing, which is a huge thing with Mahler. And so there's a lot of conjectural filling out needed to make the thing a satisfying listen. And the best completion, and there have been at least half a dozen, maybe more, was the first one, Derek Cook, because Cook did the least. I mean, that's really the bottom line. Everyone else tried to do more, and it really astonishes me listening to these other completions by Clinton Carpenter and Hugh Wheeler and Rudolph Barshai, these people, just how bad they are at sounding like Mahler. I mean, Mahler had one of the most distinctive sounds in the world. He was probably the greatest symphonic orchestrator that ever lived. His whole approach to using instruments was so musical and just fabulous and characteristic. So you'd think someone could at least fake it convincingly, but no, they can't, because each work almost represented a different version of his aesthetic. And so he had to do it himself. Now, the Adagio, of course, gets played pretty regularly. The Purgatorio movement, which is technically complete, doesn't get played very often. It's very interesting why it doesn't. The reason it doesn't is because Mahler wrote the whole thing up until the point where the opening section returns. There, he only wrote da capo, take it from the top, and then a coda for the ending. And the problem with that is that, you see, Mahler never repeated anything literally. And he certainly never repeated anything literally with the same orchestration. I mean, there are two places where he actually wrote literal exposition repeats. That's a different thing, a different formal thing. But otherwise, his style is almost completely developmental. And so there's this sense in the little Purgatorio movement that although it says da capo, he was going to play the same music again. He wasn't going to score it exactly the same way. And it's a real problem. Cook just takes him at his word and does exactly the same thing, which is what you should do. If you're going to do it in some other way, it would have to sound like what Mahler would do, and we can't know what Mahler would have done. So it works in the Cook rescoring. A lot of people added stuff and diddled around with these, the Mahler 10th. And I can't accept it as an actual work of Mahler. I can't. because for me, it's after the second movement. There's just too much. The third movement, which is the Purgatorio, pardon me. There's just too much missing. The scherzo, the second movement, well, it's a little thin sounding, but you can get away with it. The last two movements are really very deeply unsatisfying, particularly the fourth movement, which I think could be fixed, but no one's done it. And the finale, which is absolutely beautiful, but I think goes on for too long in its last phase. I think Mahler might have cut a few bars, who knows. And where the big climax, where the nasty chord comes back, still has not been successfully realized in terms of how you get into it and how you get out of it. And that's a function of orchestration, because the conception is perfectly clear. So the fifth is always going to be controversial. The 10th is always going to be controversial. But you can't argue that Mahler did not finish it in some way that allows for plausible efforts at completion. And that's what makes it sort of a fascinating case study. All of these are individual cases. They all present their own unique problems. And the last and most unique of all, Mozart's Requiem. Now, I can't stand Mozart's Requiem. I'm not happy with any of the completions. The one that we all play was by Mozart's colleague Süssmayr, who certainly knew Mozart's style. And people have complained and griped about him, and there have been other attempts by people like Robert Levin, who thinks he's Mozart reincarnated, and people like that, to finish it in more Mozartian lines or to play less and do things. And everyone, has the right to tinker. But what sold me on Süssmayr, if I'm going to deal with it at all, is the fact that what I always considered the stupidest part of the piece, which is the tuba mirum with that ridiculous trombone solo, and absolutely Yes, dear? Mildred wants to play. Okay, I know. You have to go get your toy. I can't do it without that. So anyway, yes. Okay. So anyway, yeah, there's this, trombone solo, tuba, mirum, sparta, and solos. It is just ridiculous. It's a jolly opera buffa trombone interlude, and then there's an aria with a trombone. It's just awful, terrible. And I learned that was what Mozart actually wrote. If you can find the sketches on IMSLP and see how much of it is actually Mozart's, and he actually thought of that. So that, after I heard that, I realized that, nothing Süssmayr did could possibly be sillier than what Mozart actually did. Who knows? Maybe it wouldn't have been one of his better works. I don't know. We don't know. My only feeling about the Mozart Requiem is that it has some lovely bits, the Lacrimosa and other things. They're very, very beautiful. Some gorgeous solo work for the soprano. But by and large, it's very sketchy. It's just patchy. It happens in little sniglets that, for me, do not cohere. And, of course, it has such a mystique surrounding it. All the mystery of the anonymous person who commissioned it and who was going to pass it off as his own work, and, commemoration of his wife's death, and Mozart being on his deathbed, and the movie Amadeus, which only made it crazier as he's dictating to Salieri, which, of course, didn't happen. And, it's never going to lose its popularity, of course, with choral societies and with listeners at large, because those who don't share my view of the work are more than welcome to have their own opinion, and because it's very listenable. It's very pretty. It is. It's lovely music, and so it's got the story behind it, the amazing story behind it, and it's pretty and pleasant and not hard to perform, and everyone likes it. So who am I? It's my problem, not the rest of the world's, clearly, when it comes to the Mozart Requiem. But that is the most famous unfinished finished piece by a long shot. So there you have it, my friends. 10 fascinating cases. And like I said, there are more, many of which I have not discussed, and some of which I've mentioned in passing, for you to think about. And they're great. I love the fact that you suggested this. Really, thank you to the person who did, because all of these things encourage critical listening. They really do. And the fearless exercise of your own opinion, and all of that's good. It's so good to have works that invite conversation. and invite people to listen and think and decide what they love and what they don't. And it's a wonderful topic. So I appreciate your giving me the inspiration to do it, and I hope I've lived up to the challenge. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.